Good morning, everyone. Welcome to First Congregational Church of Langsburg's online service. Thank you for joining us here in this digital space. My name is Ellie, and I'll be your host for today. Today is the 22nd week of Ordinary Time, and we are completing our series entitled Hard to Swallow, which has been an exploration through the difficult sayings of Jesus in Mark 10. But before we explore this section, we have a few poems, prayers, and readings for us along the way. Blessings on the journey.
Hi, my name is Liza. Today's call worship.
He raises and delivers us from death. And even now he shows us how to live, that we might savor life with every breath. That we might taste and see, might truly thrive, might see the good days that he wants for us, and make the best of all he has to give. And so he comes to live as one of us and teaches us afresh the ways of peace. He lives the fullest life in front of us and shows us how to break the bonds, release the captive, see the truth that sets us free, to choose the right and to do it, to increase the reach of love, the possibility of fruitful life together, and to hear the poor cry out and help them speedily. Psalm 34, retold by Malcolm Geit.
We light this candle
to remind us of the humanity of Christ, who lived a full human experience like us, so we can now embrace every facet of our humanity, body, mind, and heart, as part of our call to become like God. We light this candle to remind us of the divine nature of Christ, who overcame with love every evil we conceived, and whose resurrection proves to all the world that love overcomes evil, sin, and even death. Say bye.
Bye!
All right, so today we are closing out our series, Hard to Swallow. This is part 4, and this has been a conversation through the chapter 10 of the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you remember, we started off with little children being brought to Jesus, and the people then, or the disciples then holding the children back. Jesus finds out about it, becomes indignant in that emotion, indignance, and then invites the children to him and says, hey, these are the models of discipleship for all of you. Unless you have the same kind of faith that these kids have, you're never going to see the kingdom of God. That was kind of hard to swallow, to elevate a child above an adult in faith and discipleship like that, especially in those days. That was a tough thing to swallow. The next week, we looked at the story of the rich young man who comes to Jesus and asks, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? Asking, how do I have the resurrection on the other side of the end of things? How am I on the right side of history? And Jesus gives him a bunch of commandments. And he says, yep, did all those things, done them all since I was a kid. And Jesus gives him one last command. He says, all right, sell everything you have and give it to the destitute, and then come and follow me. And the man goes away sad because he had many things, many possessions, and the actual term there is much property. So he was a landowner that had many tenants. And his family gave him the land and never practiced the Jubilee and returned the land back to its original owners. After the 49-year period. So then last week we looked at another passage where James and John ask for prominent positions of power within Christ's kingdom. And Jesus says, actually, if you want positions of prominence, then you need to take on the attitude and behaviors of a servant, a diakonos, which was the Greek word for servant or table waiter. So if you want to be great, then you have to be servant of all. And that was tough to swallow for James and John. And now today we have a passage where it closes this chapter out. And Jesus has gone from northern Galilee, where he hung out for most of this gospel, and he's taken a southern route down towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards the crucifixion moment. He knows he's going to be arrested. He's taught already 3 times his disciples. He's taught them 3 times that he's going to go to Jerusalem, suffer, die, and resurrect. And they haven't liked those 3 teachings at all. But now they're on their way to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, and also Jesus knows this is the time that he will be arrested, crucified, dead, buried, and then eventually resurrect. Now they're following a southern road that goes along the Jordan River, and it passes through a town called Jericho. And through Jericho, that's the last stop on the way to Jerusalem. So this passage here takes place just as they're leaving Jericho. It's the last rest stop on the way to Jerusalem. They're about 12 miles. It's all uphill. It's a tremendous climb between Jericho and Jerusalem. It's a 1 kilometer elevation lift in just 12 miles. So it is uphill all the way. And they're making that climb, as many people in the past have always done. They're singing the Psalms of Ascent as they ascend to Jerusalem, literally singing, "Who may ascend the holy hill," and all of that jazz. And this is the thing that happens right before the triumphal entry, when Jesus comes into town on a donkey and claims to be the king of everything. That's kind of the stage is set, and now let's have this passage read to us, and then we will kind of explore it a little bits and bits on the other side, because it's very interesting.
Everyone, today's scripture is from Mark 10, verses 46 through 52. Then they reached Jericho, and as Jesus and his disciples left town, a large crowd followed him. A blind beggar named Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, was sitting beside the road. When Bartimaeus heard that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." "Be quiet," many of the people yelled at him, but he only shouted louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." When Jesus heard him, he stopped and said, "Tell him to come here." So they called the blind man. "Cheer up," they said, "come on, he's calling you." Bartimaeus threw aside his coat, jumped up, and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. "My rabbi," the blind man said, "I want to see." And Jesus said to him, "Go, for your faith has healed you." Instantly, the man could see, and he followed Jesus down the road.
All right, it says that they reached Jericho, and they're kind of coming out of Jericho, and the disciples are following him, and then a large crowd is also following him. Now, why mention Jericho? Well, it's the last rest stop on the way to Jerusalem for the classic going from Galilee down to Jerusalem. They take the southern road. It's the main highway. It's the last rest stop. But in Jericho, this is the second largest city in Israel. It's a very prominent place. It's a very famous place. And because of the elevation drop, there is a significant difference, even though it's just 12 and a half miles from Jerusalem. The rainfall actually is the significance and difference of rainfall between the 2 places, Jerusalem and Jericho, is so significant that it makes this place like a desert oasis, because they don't get much rain at all, while Jerusalem gets dumped on because they're at the top of a mountain. And that mountain acts as a rain shadow, so that rain can't get through. Therefore, they have this tropical paradise just 12 miles from Jerusalem. And it was a vacation home for a lot of the royalty, like the Herods were there, a lot of the aristocracy, the high uppity-ups, like the Sadducees. They were the richest people in all of Jerusalem. And a lot of wealthy priests would kind of retire there, or just kind of, that was the spot they wanted to be, because it was like getting, Miami, Florida or something. That's where they wanted to be. And it's also this passage, this city is famous in a different parable that Jesus tells. The Good Samaritan on the road to Jericho. Between Jerusalem and Jericho, a man is robbed there, and the Good Samaritan takes care of him. So this is kind of a famous city. Everyone knows about it. And it's very rich, it's very luxurious, it's very ritzy. And Jesus has taken this long road south from northern Galilee down to Jerusalem, which passes through Jericho. He's on his way to the crucifixion. And he's been teaching the disciples about his suffering and his death and resurrection, and they've been totally oblivious to how this is actually going to work. They just can't see it. Jesus has told them over and over again, but they can't hear it, they can't see it. And this is totally contrasted with the character that we are about to be introduced to in this next verse. Because the disciples, while they can physically see and they can physically hear, were introduced to a blind beggar on the outside of Jericho. And this man can't see, and yet he has perception more than the disciples do. He can't see, and yet he sees. So let's take a look at this character. He's really cool. We should also be reminded that there is a beggar sitting on the outside of a very rich and ritzy city. This is supposed to catch our attention because in the Old Testament, in the prophets, there is a specific verse that our mind should be drawn immediately to, and it's out of Exodus 16, verses 49 through 50. And this is what Ezekiel says. He says, "Now this was the sin of your sister city, Sodom." Remember Sodom and Gomorrah, totally destroyed with fire and everything? Well, Ezekiel actually spells out what they were guilty of. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy. They were haughty and old and did detestable things before me. Therefore I did away with them, as you have seen. Whew. So the sin of Sodom was to let the poor and the sick and the crippled sit outside the gates and not do anything to help them. And here we have a man who's born blind. Not born blind, he's blind. And he is sitting outside the gates of this ritzy, rich, extravagant city, and he is consigned to beggar status. And this is the extent of the social care that this disabled man gets in this time. Try and survive on charity and almsgiving of strangers. That's all you get. Now what he did get was a special coat. Fancy coat. That's so generous. He gets a fancy coat identifying him as a beggar. It's called the beggar's mantle. And it gave him permission to sit outside of the city gates and collect alms. And this coat was kind of like his badge of beggar status. I've been a pre-approved beggar. I'm allowed to be here. You can't mess with me and kick me out and all that stuff. So he was allowed to sit there at the gates and receive alms. And this was how he was able to provide for his needs. This is totally surviving on the generosity of other people. All the while, Jericho sits in decadence and luxury, and this man sits at the gate and is surviving on the breadcrumbs that people toss his way. Now it says that when Bartimaeus hears that Jesus of Nazareth was nearby, he began to shout something. "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Interesting phrase here. Now, what really caught my attention was Bartimaeus hears. Now, this is the Greek word to have the ability to hear, not just to, oh, I heard something, but he has the ability to hear. And what's really interesting is this is a man perceived as disabled. He's blind, he can't see, he's sitting outside the gates begging for money. And here, he has the ability to hear better than the disciples, because the disciples have been getting the teaching from Jesus that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer, die, and resurrect. And the disciples have been fighting it tooth and nail the whole way. Peter actually took Jesus aside in chapter 8 and rebuked his own rabbi, which is totally unheard of. And then in chapter 9, after Isaiah, the disciples start arguing about who's the greatest. And then in chapter 10, he says it again, and James and John kind of sneak in and say, okay, would you give us places of prominence in your coming kingdom? So here, Bartimaeus has the ability to hear better than the disciples who do not have any kind of a disability labeled upon them. And the disciples have proven themselves unable to hear Jesus' teaching on his suffering, death, and resurrection. And Mark takes special note to say that this man has the ability of hearing. Not just he heard something or perceived something, but he has the ability to hear. And then he speaks up. Jesus, son of David. Son of David is this kingly and messianic title that nobody in the book of Mark has ever given to Jesus. Nobody has attributed this kingly title to Jesus except for this guy. And Jesus here is finally letting his identity as Messiah come out. And this is the first person that announces that the king is here. The king is returned. The king is on his way to Jerusalem. Now, in the next passage is going to be the triumphal entry, where everyone else is going to acknowledge that this is the son of David, that this is the king come back to Israel. But nobody until this point has affirmed this for Jesus. Jesus has known it, but nobody else on the outside of Jesus' own thoughts and minds and things has affirmed it for him. And so this blind beggar is the one who is able to hear, and he's actually able to see that this is Jesus, the son of David. And he cries out, "Have mercy on me." Now, he's been sitting at this gate for who knows how long, and he's been begging, and he's been blind, and society has come down upon him and labeled him some kind of a sinner. You're getting what you deserve, because there are some psalms that say that the wicked will be reduced to beggar status, and the righteous won't have to beg for their food. So here he is sitting begging for food, and that psalm comes to their mind, and they say, literal translation, this man must have done something to screw up somewhere. And he cries out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Okay, something happens next that really sheds light on the social situation going on here. The people around him start saying, "Be quiet, shut up, stay silent." Many of the people were yelling at him this thing. But he only shouted louder, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, for years, this man has had no voice because of his life circumstances. And he was just kind of handed, "Wear this coat, sit here outside this gate, beg for your food, take whatever scraps we throw at you. You get what you get, and that is it, and toughen up." For years, this culture he found himself within had this response: be quiet, shut up, take what you get, you're getting what you deserve, toughen up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, whatever. They're telling him, shut up, this is your fault, or you're not worthy to be saying anything at all. And here he cries out all the more for Jesus Christ, Son of David, have mercy on me. He's crying it even louder as they're telling him to shut up. But this response from the people around him is what he has been dealing with his entire time of being a beggar outside the gates of this luxurious city of Jericho. People have just been saying to him, shut up, sit still, take it like a man, pull yourself up by your bootstraps if you really want to do something. This is your fault. This is whatever. And here he denies all that and starts shouting even louder. Now, Jesus just taught the rich young man to sell all his possessions and to give it to the destitute. And here is a concrete case study on why. Because this man is outside a luxurious, rich, wealthy, decadent city, and he's on the outside of it, not able to go in and participate in it. And this actually reminds me of a parable of the rich man and Lazarus, who is a beggar allowed to sit at the gate of the rich man's house and live off the scraps of that guy's decadence. Now, this man was actually being charitable to allow Lazarus to sit outside his gates and beg. He had every right to shoo him off his steps, but he says, you know what? I'm a nice guy. I'm a good fella, and I'm going to allow Lazarus to stay here, and he can, I'm not going to shoo him away. I got, influential and wealthy friends, and as they go by and come in and out, they'll be able to, it's a good thing I'm doing for this guy named Lazarus. See how nice of a guy I am? And everyone listening to this parable is saying, man, what a nice guy. He's doing something awesome. He's being very charitable. He's seen in a positive light, and then all of a sudden both men die, and one ends up on one side of a divide in the afterlife, and one ends up on the other side. The rich man is suffering anguish and judgment, and the crowd is just utterly shocked. It's like, wait a second, we thought that the rich charitable guy was supposed to be on the other side, And obviously the wicked leper beggar guy did something wrong with his life, should be on the other side. And the clue here is when the guy says, I have 5 brothers, I want to warn them about this. He still doesn't get it in his head why he's here in this place. Let's do a little bit of math. Hebrew math is fun because they get into symbolism of numbers. Now there's 5 brothers. He has 5 brothers. And if you include him, that's 6. I am not the 6-fingered man, but there you go. 6 people. Now the number 6 in the Hebrew culture and language is a number of imperfection and incompletion. Now if Lazarus was invited to come to the man's table as a brother, how many would have been there? You have 6, then you have 7. You would have had 7 people at the table, and the number 7 is a complete and perfect number. And Jesus is saying, by not inviting this man to your table as a brother, as one of your brothers, you have done a great injustice in society. And here, even now in the afterlife, you're declaring you only have 5 brothers when Lazarus should have been considered one of your brothers. Jesus uses this story not to illustrate what the afterlife is going to be like, but he illustrates what holiness is, a charity that extends the invitation to our tables of inclusion. Okay, so when Jesus hears this guy, he stops and says, tell that guy to come here. So they called the blind man, cheer up, he's calling you, come on over. And Bartimaeus threw aside his coat, jumped up, and came to Jesus. Now, the Greek there is take courage, stand up, he is calling. And I just love that right there. Now, remember, he was given a coat. He was given a coat that proved him to be in beggar status. And it's how he lived, it's how he ate, it's how he survived. It was his job to sit here and sit on a specific area with his coat on and collect alms. Now, he does take courage and stand up. And he tosses his beggar coat to the side before Jesus even says a word other than, hey, come here. The guy gets so excited, he takes his beggar's coat and he strips it off and he tosses it to the side. That was his livelihood. That was his life. That was his everything he had. And he tosses it to the side. Now, this act of faith and courage is greater than any of the disciples thus far, who are actively following him and actively a disciple. And this man, because he tosses his single possession of value to the side to go and see Jesus, he's the antithesis of the rich young man who was just a few previous passages earlier, who was invited to sell everything he had, but couldn't do it because he owned much property and it was too great and he was too sad and he left because he couldn't do it. And then Jesus says, the last shall be first. And here it is, right here in this passage. He taught about it, and now there's like a concrete illustration of this guy, the last becoming first before our eyes. He sells everything he has, the one coat off his back that gave him the ability to beg at the gates, and tosses it aside. The one thing. He took courage, he stood up, he recognized Jesus' calling, and he took his beggar status, tossed it aside, his singular possession, and runs after Jesus. And that was something that the rich young man could not do because he had too many things. And this guy has one thing, gave it up and followed Jesus. So Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? I think it's pretty obvious what this guy wants at this point. He's thrown his coat aside. He's run up to Jesus. He's a blind beggar sitting on the outside of Jerusalem. Obviously, he wants something. Why did Jesus ask such an obvious question? I think really interesting. The last week's passage we looked at started off with a question where the disciples came up to Jesus and say, hey, we want you to do whatever we ask. And Jesus is like, what do you want me to do? Hey, give us places of prominence in your kingdom. And Jesus says, can't do that. It's not mine to give. So here, he's asking, what do you want me to do for you? This blind beggar actually has more clarity of sight than the disciples in the previous passage, just in chapter 9. They've been following Jesus for like 9 chapters, and they don't see And Jesus passes by a blind man who can't see, but he is the one who's showing tremendous ability to see and sight. Now, how does he respond? He says, my rabbi, or Rabboni. The blind man said, I want to see again. And Jesus said to him, go, for your faith has healed you. And instantly the man could see, and he followed Jesus down the road. Now, the term Rabboni is what is here for my rabbi or great rabbi. And this is used in the entire New Testament only twice. Mary uses it in the resurrection passage of John, the Gospel of John, and this blind Bartimaeus character from our passage today uses it. That's the only time Rabboni is ever used. Rabbi is a little bit more common. What's the difference between rabbi and Rabboni? A rabbi is just a teacher of the Torah. It's anybody who has like a high respect. They've gone through training. They have their credentials. They're a rabbi. They can bring in disciples. And they're considered, official as like a pastor, Now, Rabboni is taking it to the next level, and it means my great master, my great teacher, my great rabbi. It's a term of high honor and high respect. And Bartimaeus is the only one in the whole Gospel of John that gives such honor to Jesus. And he says, I want to see again. Now, the term again there is used. He wasn't born blind. He wants to see again, which tells us that tragedy hit this man somewhere and he lost his sight at some point because he wants to see again. Now, society believed he did some kind of wickedness and received his justice, and he probably wondered what the heck happened too. Like, why is this happening to me? But he wants to see again. And so Jesus says, your faith has saved you, or your faith has made you whole. And what faith exactly? What did he do? Well, obviously, tossing the coat aside before even talking with Jesus was saying, I am giving up the one possession I have, and I believe that I will no longer be a beggar on the other side of this conversation. He does that before he even talks to Jesus. That was an act of faith. What about just the act of getting up and finding Jesus, even though he can't see? He's like, tell the guy to come here. It doesn't say anyone led him to Jesus or he was taken to Jesus. Tell the guy to come. And he got up and walked and found Jesus, even though he couldn't see. What about just refusing to be quiet, even though everyone around him was yelling at him, shut up, be quiet, Jesus is too important for you. But just yelling for Jesus and then getting louder as people, or maybe it was just an intense understanding. I need to get to this guy, whatever it takes. And all the above was the act of faith that he had that made him whole. So this is what following Jesus leads to. It leads to seeing, and it leads to awareness. And that seeing and awareness lead to greater compassion, empathy, and capacity to love other people and yourself. This is what following Jesus leads to. Now, he saw Jesus for who he was. He's called him Son of David, even though he couldn't see. He saw the reform that Jesus called for with all of his teachings. About how the kingdom of God was to be operating within here. He saw the injustice of the world firsthand because he was under its oppression. He saw it all from the inside. And now he can be a part of a movement of the kingdom of God that does not replicate the broken patterns of the world that put him where he was, because he can see it from the inside. He has a perspective that's so valuable. Now, the question here to all of us is, do you want to see? Do we want to see? Do I want to see the areas that you are strong and gifted to help? Do you want to see those? Because it requires a lot of sacrifice and dedication to do something about it, to do something with it. Do you want to see the areas of darkness, the areas that are complicit in the broken world that uses hate and violence to maintain power and control? Do you want to see that? Because that exists in every human soul. We all have a great strength and we all have a great darkness. And do we want to see? Do we want to see either of those? Or would we rather just go through the motions of this day? Do we want to see the ingrained hatred and fear that infects all of human nature around us, that leads to all kinds of war? Do we want to see that ugliness? It's scary when you see it. Or do you want to see also the other end of that? Do you want to see the imprinted image of God upon all human souls? created in the dignity, love, and image of God, and filled with the very breath of God? Do you want to see the beauty in every human life? Or do you want to keep thinking of yourself as better than somebody else out there? Do we want to be able to see all of us as a part of a human family on this planet Earth? Because once you see, you follow. There is no other choice. Once you see, you will follow. They just follow one another. Because when Jesus actually tells this man, he gives him sight and tells him, go. He tells him to go. Like, okay, you're dismissed. Your faith has made you well. He tells him to go. But the verse ends with him following. He didn't go. He didn't obey the command to go. He's like, I'm following this guy. He's my Rabboni. I'm going to follow him. Now, did he do an act of disobedience? I don't think so. What Mark is doing here is something that's really neat narratively. Jesus tells him to go, but he follows. And Jesus actually looks at his disciples. He's like, hey, come, follow me. But they don't follow, even though they're like there. They're not doing it. And then eventually, when the crucifixion happens, they flee. So here, Jesus is actually elevating. Mark is elevating this Bartimaeus above all the other characters as the model of discipleship that's better than the disciples that have been following him. Because Jesus tells him to go and he follows, but Jesus tells the disciples to follow and they flee when the thing is there. And what's the difference? The difference is Bartimaeus can see, the disciples can't. Because once you see, you follow. This man does. The disciples eventually will, after the resurrection, they'll see and they'll follow. And the question remains, will you?
Good morning. I'm going to do the benediction today. I'm in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian from 2 years ago. So my peace actually means a lot to me. So here we go. We have a duty to speak out for those who have no voice or are not being listened to. The practice of compassion would show us that no sister or brother deserves to be excluded and pushed onto the bleak margins where life is sheer pain and endurance. We should at least begin to have some conversations with these members of our human family. It would open our eyes. When our compassion awakens, our responsibility becomes active and creative. When we succumb to indifference, we blaspheme against the gifts that we could never earn, that have been so generously given to us. The duty of privilege is absolute integrity. By John Donahue.
Thank you so much for joining us online today. We hope this service has been a blessing to you. What now? 1. You can participate. If you'd like to participate in our services, we would welcome your readings with a simple phone recording. These are chosen in advance and can be given to you a few weeks early. 2. Partner. If you would like to give financially to ensure the continuation of this online service, there is a link on the bottom of your screen. And 3. Subscribe. You may subscribe on YouTube or like our page on Facebook to stay updated with our online services. We hope you have found some hope, help, and healing today. See you next week.
Now it says when Bartimaeus hears that Jesus of Nazareth, wow, part I lost count. I don't know.